Hi everyone, welcome to part 3. Okay, the next section is entitled Restricted Advance on a File in order to give it up in favor of another file, or the indirect exploitation of a file, with the additional the file as a springboard and its similarity to a career as a diplomat, the unusual which is sense of humor. And you know, in this position, the direct use of the F file would be with the rook takes F7, after having forced away the defense of the rook here on F8. However, that's impossible with the limited material here on the board, and white can instead play rook F5, which is going to win the B5 pawn, and then follow up with the rook B7, penetrating to the 7th rank. Nimzowitsch emphasizes that it is of prime importance to look at the logical content of this maneuver. As rook takes F7 wouldn't be played, we cannot consider it to be a direct exploitation of the F file in accordance with our earlier definition. However, the F file has a fair bit to do with white's winning of the B pawn, so we can correctly define the process as the indirect use of the F file as a springboard of sorts. Nimzowitsch makes one of his parallels here, comparing the difference to that of a person who pursues a career in diplomacy purely for power, and another who is a dreamer and pursues such a career in order to move in refined circles and hopes in the long run to win the hand of a millionaire's daughter. In the former case, the career is sought purely for its own merits. In the latter case, the choice of career is merely a springboard for other things, in Nimzowitsch's words, into the future father-in-law's checkbook. And you know, this is another example of the same thing we're talking about. From this position, playing bishop d4 and following up with a rook g7 check would be the direct exploitation of the g file, whereas playing rook g3 followed up with a rook h3 and winning the h pawn would of course be an indirect use of the G file. And Nimzowitsch, you know, stresses that difference several times in the chapter. And this position here is from one of Nimzowitsch's games, and he uses it to illustrate the indirect use of the C file as a springboard to the A file. And we can see here that he's got, you know, a well-posted knight. He's got this weak pawn to attack here, and you know, he's definitely got a reasonable advantage in the position. There's very little for black here at the moment. Play continued with the rook c5, and it was followed up with rook a5 to get onto the A file and, you know, attack a7. And that's pretty much it. And Nimzowitsch closes this section with the observation that averagely gifted critics would deny that the distinction outlined between direct and indirect exploitation of a file has any practical value. And he continues by pointing out that the direct exploitation of a file will be of greater value to more intellectual players, as it casts a lot more light on the nature of files and how to use them effectively. So his point was that some people might point out there seems to be not much distinction or difference between using a file indirectly and using it directly, but to Nimzowitsch, you know, he felt that there was an important difference and that it should be noted, and that people should take notice of the fact that there is a difference. The next section is entitled The Outpost, with the subtitles The Radius of Attack, the story about the newspaper, which pieces should occupy the outpost on a flank file and a central file, and finally the exchange of roles and what it might prove. So let's take a look at this position. white has pretty good control of the center and the D file for operations. Black is keeping an eye on the center with his pawn here at D6, and he can use the E file for operations. Objectively, the position is pretty equal, and white needs to come up with some kind of plan or strategy. And you know, it's hard to penetrate very far down the D file because this D6 pawn is protected by the C7 pawn, and thus, you know, this D6 pawn is solid, and it's what he refers to regularly as granite. You know, it's very hard to break through or break down. And you know, for example, if white were to play rook d2 and rook e d1 and double on the d file against this granite pawn, then you know, we would laugh at him, and according to Nimzowitsch, the d6 pawn would laugh at the rooks. So what can be done instead? White can try and undermine the d6 pawn by playing e5 at the right moment, but that's going to be hard to achieve due to the knight here on g6, and you know, we can't do it without giving black the e file. If this pawn is liquidated, black will get good play down here, so it's also no good. And you know, perhaps we could use the d file indirectly, for example rook d4 to a4 and queenside play. But this too doesn't achieve much, as black is solid here, although he would be if he had an isolated pawn on the queen side. For example, if the a pawn was here and the b pawn was missing, then he could maybe pile up some pressure, and that might be an effective plan. But you know, there's no real need to think so deeply in this position. White can gain something of an edge immediately with the move knight d5, and there's a few things to point out here. d5 is the outpost square, and the knight on d5 is the outpost. The definition of an outpost is one of our pieces, often a knight, which is placed inside enemy territory, i.e. in their half of the board, and protected by a pawn, and the outpost square constitutes a base for new attacks, and due to its huge radius of attack here, the knight is very unpleasant for our opponent. If we flip the board here, we can see that it's very uncomfortable for black. This knight sitting on his position here, it's stacking c7 immediately, and it creates a lot of constant pressure to be dealt with. So obviously we don't want it there. We want to get rid of it if possible. And what we're hoping by putting the knight here is that it will induce the weakening of black's position as a result, for example with c6, which will greatly reduce black's defensive resources on the d file, because now this d6 pawn becomes very weak. He could have played instead rook a c8 to defend c7, but Nimzowitsch comments you need iron nerves to leave a threatening knight placed in the center of your position for any length of time. In fact, he says that it's worse than putting up with a fly on your nose for even 5 minutes. So, knight d5, c6, knight c3, and as I said, due to the c6 push, the d6 pawn is now fatally weak, and white has control of this square d5, so it can't be advanced to get rid of the weakness. And now white can follow up with rook d2 and rook e d1, and the d6 pawn will not be in a laughing mood. Nimzowitsch stresses that the power of the outpost is directly linked to its strategic connection to its rear ranks, i.e. the often rooks, as opposed to solely its own attacking strength from the square upon which it is placed. And if we go back and we have a look at the position after knight d5, Nimzowitsch compares in this position the knight to a newspaper, the rook on d1 as the capital behind it, and the e4 pawn as a supporting political party. A newspaper with both these things can be considered to be resting on solid foundations. However, if one of these conditions is not met, the newspaper or outpost would lose a significant amount of its relevance and reputation. If in the outpost position there had been a pawn here on d3, then the closed d-file could represent a lack of funding for the newspaper. There's no rook backing it up from the baseline, and black would be able to play in that case c6 safely, because this d6 pawn being weakened would be nowhere near so much as a big deal. And also, if the e4 pawn had been on e3 instead, then there's no political party supporting the newspaper, and black can solve his problems with c6, and after knight c3 play d5 without, and the pawn being on e4 instead means that the d6 pawn will remain backward for some time, instead of simply playing d5 and having a solid position. So now we can look at another position that shows similar elements to what we've just been talking about. In this position, which could arise from the Giuoco piano as well as other openings, and many more pieces could be added on both sides, and the positional ideas would remain the same. So we can see that white has the f file to use and the f5 square as an outpost, whereas black has the d file and the d4 square as an outpost. As we look at it now, both files are biting on so-called granite. d3 pawn is protected by c2, and f6 is protected by g7. And if white wants to break down the strong point on f6 here, he can, for example, play his knight to f5 via e2 g3 and then get to f5 that way. And once it's there, it attacks g7, and it can be followed up with the rook f3 g3 to increase the pressure. And of course, this is played in the hope of provoking black into playing g6, after which the mission of the knight on f5 can be considered achieved, because after it moves, the f6 pawn will have become, and it's also for the outpost piece to be exchanged off. And if the attacking side has played correctly, a new piece should take over from the exchange piece. Alternatively, if white was to recapture, for example, on f5 here with a pawn, say e takes f5, then e4 would become free for pieces, for example a rook, and that could get some activity by moving over to the queen side, or doubling, or doing whatever it likes, and then undermining f6. And white could also consider opening the g file with the advance of his g pawn, and create play in that way too. And a pawn on f5 would cement the f6 pawn in place, which makes it useful, because then that the pawn and square you're attacking is not going anywhere, and so you can then pile up the pressure and you should be able to win it. Okay. Now in this example, the outpost square is on a flank file, and if you want to consider the position and find the best move for white, then stop the video now. Rook g6 is the best move, as outpost squares on a flank file should be occupied by heavy caliber pieces, i.e. rooks or queens. Incidentally, the flank files are the A, B, G and H, whilst the others are the central ones. A knight on G6 instead of a rook would be less significant, as its radius of attack is smaller from that square as opposed to one of the central ones. However, a rook on G6 is excellent because it begins the process of taking total control of the file. White can follow up with the rook D G1 next, and he has gained complete control of a crucial positional element that was merely contested and equally controlled in the starting position, meaning that neither side could properly operate down it. For example, if white had played rook G2 instead, it's no good because a rook takes G2, knight takes G2, rook G8, and now black wins the G file. Alternatively, say rook G4, rook takes G4, H takes G4, rook G8, attacking G4, now knight G6, and although white is a pawn up, it's very difficult to use it for any advantage or create anything with it in this position. So rook G6 is best, and rook takes G6 is forced, or rook DG1 is coming, but this hands white a big advantage after H takes G6 due to the monster passed pawn and the possibility of playing knight F3 and rook G1, G4, H4 attacking H6. Alternatively, white can play F takes G6 and followed up with knight F5, and so good. So now let's say rook G1, rook G8, then rook G1. And you know, a characteristic exchange of rooks has occurred, and it's important to note that before black played rook takes G6, the H5 pawn was supporting the rook on G6, and here after the exchange a rook supports a white pawn on G6 here on G1. And Nimzowitsch felt that this proved that there's a strategic connection between the pawn that protects the outpost and the G file itself, i.e. the pawn element of the outpost can become the next strategical focus, as it's possible that it will become passed, or that it will become a holding force against your opponent, offering further play, as in that previous example. Okay, so this will be the final example for this chapter. As from one of Nimzowicz's own games against a friend of his. And here, you know, white has a good advantage in the position. And his first move, knight F4, is simply to get the knight developed to a better square. And his opponent answered with rook A G8. And now we can see some of the ideas that Nimzowitsch was talking about coming into effect. The first move he played, it's kind of obvious what it would be, rook H7, and he stresses that this should be seen as the occupation of an outpost rather than the 7th rank, as it's that set of rules which he's illustrating here. And white's advantage is now growing rapidly. He threatens rook D G1, and an exchange of rooks will be forced, resulting in a passed pawn, which is going to be decisive. Black's next move is forced, bishop E8. We can have a quick look at why. Let's say he plays instead A6. Now will come rook DH1. Rook takes H7 is forced. G takes H7, and this creates a serious problem. Black has to play something like rook E8 here. If he plays rook H8, knight G6 check, king E8, knight takes H8, it's completely winning. So we see why black has to defend G6 with the bishop. So bishop E8, and now rook DH1, rook takes H7, G takes H7, and the advantage of the open file has been turned into a passed pawn. So rook H8 is forced, and now comes knight G6 check, again forcing bishop takes G6, where the rook is lost. F takes G6. Now black played king E6, and Nimzowitsch played a great move here. Again, if you want to try and spot it, then stop the video now. Rook H5 is the move, and it's played with positional ideas in mind. This traps the king in his own half of the board, so he can't try and go to e5 and win the e pawn, and or go from e5 to f4 and g5 and try and win a g6 pawn. So it's totally trapped, and he also can't try and play f5 to free his position, and so it keeps black totally passive with a very bad rook against an active good one for white. Play continued b6, and Nimzowitsch pointed out he could play b4 here to keep black totally bound, but he plays c4 because he's got another idea in mind. Play continued c5, a4, a5, so the queen side is getting locked, and now Nimzowitsch simply brings his king over, and after king d6 and king f5, black is in zugzwang. His king is going to have to move away from e6, which allows white to play e5, and this makes a breakthrough possible, because the f6 pawn will be removed from the black position, and this will in turn mean that the white rook can get access to f7, which is going to be decisive. So king e7, e5, f takes e5, king takes e5, king d7, rook f5, and the rook's going to f7, and the 7th rank with decisive effect, and g7 will fall, and it's going to create connected pass pawns, so it's completely hopeless for black. So it was a very nice endgame from Nimzowitsch, and this rook to f5 and then f7 comes under the restricted advance on a file designation that we looked at already, and it was a great display of positional ideas, and very instructive explanation of how to use the open file in your games. So I hope you enjoyed the second chapter. Please leave any comments or thoughts.